Some plants need large amounts of potassium and show unusual deficiency symptoms. For example, yellow shoulder or uneven ripening in tomatoes is related to potassium deficiency, as are weak stems and lodging in grains. Lodging meaning falling over. So there are some things you can look for in the plants to see if potassium is lacking.
In this episode of Voices from the Field, NCAT Sustainable Agriculture Specialist Nina Prater and her husband Jeremy Prater, a cattle and meat goat farmer, explore the science and history of potassium. Potassium fertilizer prices have increased 45% in the past few years over the historical average, and finding ways to reduce the need for off-farm inputs of potassium can improve a farm's bottom line. Nina and Jeremy discuss potassium in the soil and in plants, and the human history around this element, before sharing different ways you can manage your soil sustainably so that they require less off-farm potassium fertilizer. Let's listen.
Hello and welcome to Voices from the Field. I'm Nina Prater, NCAT Sustainable Agriculture Specialist based out of our Fayetteville, Arkansas office. Today we will explore the history and science of potassium, the K of NPK, in order to understand sustainable management of this essential nutrient. If you missed the previous episodes about nitrogen and phosphorus, I encourage you to go listen to those as well. Fertilizer prices have risen dramatically in recent years. For potassium, prices aren't as high as their peak in 2022, but they are still much higher than historical trends. According to a report by the Department of Agricultural and Consumer Economics of the University of Illinois, potash prices were an average of $350 per ton from 2016 to 2020. And as of spring of 2023, the cost was $645 per ton, and that's a 45% increase. So in order to stay profitable, we need to figure out ways to maintain productivity while reducing the need for fertilizer. And with me today is a farmer who knows a lot about a lot of things, but only the basics about potassium. My husband, Jeremy Prater. Our family has a small cow-calf operation, and we also raise meat goats using adaptive management grazing strategies to keep the pasture productive and to build soil health. You may have heard Jeremy on this podcast before, where he taught me all about electric fencing. The reason I've invited Jeremy to join me is to keep the focus practical and also comprehensible. It is easy for me to get lost in the details and to really geek out on some soil chemistry stuff. So, Jeremy, your job is to keep asking me all the clarifying questions you need, because probably other people will be asking themselves those questions in their heads. Also, Jeremy just always adds a unique spin to conversation. So thank you, Jeremy, for joining me today.
Yeah, glad to do it. This is always fun when we get together like this. It's a lot better studio setup than we had on the last one, which was in the cab of my truck with angry children outside posting notes on the
windows. Yes, in the winter, in peak pandemic time, that was memorable. I was so cold by the end of that episode recording. So this is much better.
Yes.
All right, Jeremy, let me introduce you to potassium, commonly called potash. And the word potash comes from the Middle Dutch word potassium.
Oh, so it's not the other potash that sometimes people talk about.
I don't know what that is.
That's a joke for stoners. It's okay.
No, not that potash. I don't know anything about that. Okay. Potassium in Middle Dutch means wood ash, not other kinds of ash. And wood ash is high in potassium and was a traditional source of the nutrient. So not a big leap to go from potassium to potash. That's pretty clear. But maybe more mysteriously, why is potassium K on the periodic table when it doesn't have a K anywhere in the word?
Right. I've always wondered that.
Yes, it's been a mystery to me for a long time, but I uncovered the reason. And the K comes from the medieval Latin word kalium, which means potash.
That's very obscure.
I know, but it's nice to know there's a reason.
Yeah. So when was it given this name? Like how long ago are we talking?
I don't know. 1800s probably? That's when they
Probably
started.
some guy in Britain.
Yeah, they just started because potassium comes from potash, potassium, potash.
Hmm.
They add the "ium" to make it sound Latinate. But I don't know when the periodic table was written.
Oh, well, that's fine. Okay, sorry, that was maybe a side quest. We don't have to go
So,
down.
yeah, okay. Anyway, I hope other people are finally glad to finally you know, clear up that mystery. So, potassium is the 8th most abundant element, and it makes up about 2.5% of the Earth's crust. And it is found in all different kinds of minerals. So it's quite an abundant element that we are working with. So since
Hmm.
it's found in all sorts of minerals, that means that it's found in all different soils because soils, the mineral portion, comes from, weathered bedrock. So like the sand, silt, and clay particles have potassium within them, and then as they weather, they release potassium and it's held in these cation exchange sites.
So you're saying the rocks in the pastures belong there, and I shouldn't be putting them in the fence rows anymore?
Well, those rocks, I would say, are very slow release potassium.
Right.
So you can put those all in the fence row all you want.
Okay. That makes me feel better.
Yes. But it means that some areas of the world are going to naturally have higher and lower levels of potassium based on what the bedrock is in those areas. So that's just going to be a natural fluctuation in what you can expect your native soils to hold.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
Another aspect of this is because clay particles have such high surface area, the type of clay that you have in your soil really influences how much potassium you have because some have much higher surface area than other types of clay.
Yeah, that
I'm
makes sense. Well, I was going to say we're in far west Arkansas, in the northwest corner, and our soils here are pretty clay. We've got a good amount of red clay underneath the topsoil. Well, sometimes right that is the topsoil in some places. Um, so, are you? What do you know about? Just because I'm being selfish now, how's our kind of clay soil affecting the potassium here?
Oh, I wish I'd looked that up ahead of time.
Oh,
Um,
well, we can talk about it, as we argue about who does dishes this evening.
yes, yeah. But I think you could probably like as I was looking this up, I saw that in certain states there are maps that show, like I saw one of Minnesota that had a map of showing which types of clays are in
Hmm.
different parts of the state. So
Oh,
for
that's
wherever
interesting.
you are, you might be able to look that up. And what you want to look up is the type of clay. So there's like illite and kaolinite and then smectite clays. And basically, the more weathered the clay particle, the smaller it gets and the less potassium it can hold.
Hmm. Okay.
So I do know like the shrink swell clays that there are a lot of in Texas hold a lot more potassium than like
Okay.
the kaolinite clays. So the plant available form is K plus. So it's a cation with a +1 charge, and it readily dissolves in water.
Hmm.
So it's not like phosphorus that adsorbs really tightly to the
Hmm.
soil. It readily dissolves in water, and it adsorbs to the surfaces of soil particles because just a refresher for people, the surfaces of the soil has a negative charge, like the surface of the organic matter and the mineral particles. And those are your cation exchange sites, are those negative charges. And so they attract things like potassium, magnesium, calcium.
Right.
So if you have a higher cation exchange capacity, you're more likely to have a higher potassium content in your soil.
And oftentimes, so we use, just for general purposes, our extension office will run a soil sample. You bring them in soil in a box and with a label on it, and then when you get that report back, it'll list all the different minerals and recommendations and whatnot. But it also has on there the cation exchange rate.
Yes. In Arkansas, the lab does an estimated cation exchange capacity, and they estimate
right.
it based on your soil texture. So, and that can help you estimate how good your soil is at holding nutrients that your plants need. And also, you can increase your cation exchange capacity by increasing your soil organic matter.
Right. And that's something with the way we graze cattle. Over the years, we've noticed just by basic management, we've seen our organic matter come up quite a bit, which has been nice.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very positive for lots of reasons. And the cation exchange capacity is one of many reasons why more organic matter is better.
Reports starting to all come together now.
I know there's so many things on those soil test reports, and someday they'll all make sense, maybe. So another interesting difference between potassium and nitrogen and phosphorus is that, unlike nitrogen and phosphorus, potassium does not cause off-farm water pollution if it gets washed away in runoff.
So it's not going to be like phosphorus where it causes the algal blooms and that sort of thing.
Right, right.
Well, that's
So,
handy.
yeah.
Given that it's water soluble, I would be more concerned. But
Right,
okay.
right. So you don't have to worry about causing nutrient pollution, but you do have to worry about wasting your money.
Right. Yeah. And most of us, that's our first thing we worry about and then
Right.
the environment next. But okay. Yeah.
Unfortunately, that's true.
Unfortunately, the human brain is just that way.
Yeah. So you can over-apply potassium and not damage the environment, but you can waste money. So now let's talk about potassium in plants. In plants, potassium is not a part of the plant's organs, organelles, or plant structures. So it's mainly a part of the liquid parts of the plants that helps regulate water and CO2 levels. I know. And it activates over 80 different enzymes responsible
That seems
for
like
things.
a lot.
It's a lot. I didn't know plants had 80 different enzymes.
Right.
But those enzymes are responsible for things like starch synthesis, photosynthesis, important stuff.
All the plant things.
All the plant things. And according to The Nature and Property of Soils, my favorite textbook, good potassium nutrition is linked to improved drought tolerance, improved winter hardiness, better resistance to certain fungal diseases, and greater tolerance to insect pests.
Yeah, I've noticed that just anecdotally, when we are starting to see an area in one of the fields that's getting low in potassium, that you can visibly see it. Like the plants don't look as healthy often; they'll sometimes change colors when other areas of the farm are not having that thing, or it's a pasture that will dry out quickly. So and this is things you notice over time. Like I didn't just show up and understand that, but you make a note like, okay, why is this pasture? Just note to self, this pasture's responding differently. And then the next time you do a soil sample, you go back to those notes and you're like, oh, look at that. It is slow in this and, whatever element. And maybe, I can just fix it that way instead of changing something else. So it's handy to make those little notes to yourself and then compare those with what your soil sample results are.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great plug for record keeping.
It is. I'm a big fan. And with that organized record keeping, that helps too. But yeah, for example, we had one pasture that was producing like 40% less than the neighboring pastures were, and it was the only limiting factor. It turned out was it was low on potassium, and as soon as we fixed that, we saw that production number come back up over time. So I mean, like, just simple things sometimes.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned like visible symptoms of deficiency. Sometimes the different symptoms of different nutrient deficiencies kind of look alike, but
Hmm.
that's why it's good to pair it with a soil test. But some deficiency symptoms are that your plants can start yellowing between the veins of the leaves, and
Hmm.
especially at the leaf tips and edges. And then eventually the leaf edges become brown.
Yep.
And I was reading an article about potassium at the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners website, MOFGA. I can put a link to that because this was a good article, especially for organic growers. And they said that some plants need large amounts of potassium and show unusual deficiency symptoms. For example, yellow shoulder or uneven ripening in tomatoes is related to potassium deficiency, as are weak stems and lodging in grains.
Hmm.
Lodging meaning falling over. So there are
Well,
some things you can look for in the plants to see if potassium is lacking.
well, that makes sense if you're, going back to its function in the plant. If its function is to kind of facilitate the movement of like the liquid parts of the plant around the plant, then you would expect the extremities of that plant to, suffer, sort of like, getting if you're getting really, really cold, your extremities feel it first or feel it
Hmm.
worst. So the plant basically just can't reach those areas. Fruit would be the extremity in the tomato case of the tomato. Yeah, it makes sense if the plant's struggling to get those nutrients moved around.
Yeah, well, or if there's not enough to go around, because potassium
Hmm.
in plants is very mobile, so it'll shunt it to wherever it's needed most. So
Well, that's
older
fascinating.
leaves can get yellow faster than the younger leaves, and then eventually the younger leaves will start yellowing. So that's sort of the introduction to potassium in soils and in plants. Now I want to shift to talking about the history of human use of potassium. And it's been so interesting to research. So I hope people enjoy this bunny trail. Jeremy, I know you love history, so I know you're
I,
going to be
I'm a big fan. I'm rubbing my hands together currently. Excited.
So, potassium is considered to be the first industrial chemical. Did you know that?
I did not. I would have. I guess I've never really thought about it, but yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, so historically, this is a quote from the Plainfield, Massachusetts Historical Society. Historically, potash was an important element in the manufacture of alum, saltpeter, soap, glass, canned leather, gunpowder, paper, bleached cotton textiles, and various woolen goods. Yeah,
Okay.
that's so many things.
Well, and it goes back further than that too. If from the potash example, where you did the etymology of the word, slash and burn agriculture in a lot aside from just clearing the land, it also is providing all those nutrients from the trees, potassium being a big one, back to the soil for your whatever you're going to grow.
Yes,
So, but
yes.
if you're right,
But
if
these
you're
are
doing
the industrial uses of it. That's
right,
an
right.
agricultural use. So,
Oh, okay. Being a linguist over there, yes.
and in the 18th century, potash became an essential ingredient in the rising textile industry. So it really was closely linked with the Industrial Revolution. It is interesting to see that it's in all of those different
Yeah.
use. There's all those different uses. And here's another fun fact. The first US patent of any kind, patent number X000001, was granted on July 31st, 1790 to Samuel Hopkins for an improvement in the making of potash and pearl ash by a new apparatus and process.
That's outrageous.
I know.
So it
The
was the first industrial chemical as well as the first U.S. patent.
Yes.
That's a good fun fact to throw out at a party.
Yes. Depends on the party, I'm thinking. But yes. And so in New England, where there were a lot of trees, that it became an important producer of potash in the 1800s, and they'd ship a lot of it to Europe, where they were doing a lot of this industrialized work. And it's kind of a forgotten, I think, element of the economics of agriculture back then. So I found this other historian who wrote about potash. He must have been fun at parties. His name was Rowman John Black. He lived from 1939 to 2018 from Williamsburg, Massachusetts, and he wrote that potash received scant mention, and it was the agricultural industry producing ash, an industry complementary to clearing farmland and lumbering. It was probably big at first, but gradually waned over a period of time as the woods were depleted. No one could I thought this was interesting. No one could afford not to be involved. Ashes had cash value and were so much an asset, no landowner could ignore the resource.
Yeah, that makes sense. Especially if you've got, even if you're harvesting timber for wood projects, you've still got all the branches and the not so good wood left over from that, and look, if you can turn it into money, then that's not a waste product anymore.
Right, right. And I read something else about how trains would be going out west, and then they would delivering goods to people colonizing the west, and then they would come back carrying ashes that people had created when they were clearing that land of trees and stuff. So it kind of paid for that movement westward.
Right. Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, because a smart train operator is never going to go anywhere.
Right.
And then if you've got this resource that's a byproduct of the Western settlement, basically, then yeah, makes perfect sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it made me really sad though, thinking about all these trees just getting burned for ash, all these old
Right,
growth,
because there's
beautiful forests.
eventually, right, because eventually there's going to be some guy who isn't doing it as a byproduct. He's primarily just murdering forests for the ashes.
Yeah,
That's how capitalism often goes, it seems like.
right. At this time, it was still mainly for industrial use, but around 1840, our friend Justus von Liebig, who has been mentioned in previous podcasts, a chemist, he discovered that potassium is a necessary element for plants, and that this caused a steep rise in demand for potassium in agriculture.
Yeah, makes sense. Folks are like, oh, that's a thing. Got to have the thing.
Yeah. Oh, this helps my plants grow. I guess I'll pay for it and add it. And Justus von Liebig also, we talked about him in other episodes, but he's the one that sort of came up with or described what he calls the law of the minimum. So if your soil has all the nutrients except for one, it will only produce as much as, that one limiting nutrient will allow.
Right.
So I found out another fun fact about Justus von Liebig, and that is that he invented beef extract, otherwise,
Okay.
which became bouillon cubes.
Right. He's got a wide career. That's an arc.
It's so random, and it was marketed as meat tea, and I just thought, ugh. Ugh.
Okay.
Yeah. So that is very much an aside, but he really liked to tinker with a lot of things. So inventor of chemical agriculture and bouillon cubes.
Oh no, it's meat tea from now on.
Meat tea.
Pass me a brick of that meat tea.
I mean, I'm a big tea drinker, but something about that does not sound right.
Well, I mean, I've often had I like to have a if we're making a stew or something, like a cup of beef broth is kind of nice on a
I
cold day.
I agree, but calling it broth is different than meat tea.
From now on, it's meat tea in this house.
Yeah, well, it'll keep me laughing anyway. So, luckily for the forests of the world, mineral potassium deposits were discovered in the 1860s, first discovered in Germany. So, mineral potassium is formed in what were ancient inland seas, and then they evaporated and left behind lots of different nutrients, including potassium, as well as sodium and other things.
So it would have been like dissolved salts, basically, or when the evaporation event happened, it allowed this to crystallize into salt forms.
Basically, mineral salts, yeah,
Yeah,
mineralized.
that's the yeah. Okay.
And so they were first discovered in Germany, but they then were found really all over the world. And now Canada is the predominant producer of potassium. They have large deposits there. So they found these different mineral sources, and the salts from them are mined and then purified, and then they yield such compounds as potassium chloride and potassium sulfate. Those are two forms.
Okay.
I have another little side note. This is definitely a side quest, but I thought it was so funny. So, the natural mineral form of potassium chloride, KCl, is called sylvite, and
Sylvite.
Sylvite. And the Latin sylva is for trees, means trees.
Sure.
And so
Uh,
I was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. Some very poetic geologist knew it had a lot of potassium and knew the wood ash connection, and they named it for that. But
mhm.
no, it was named after a Dutch chemist, Francois Sylvius de Lebeau.
So he was related to trees.
He was related to trees. It had really nothing to do with trees. But for a
Well,
minute there, before I dug a little deeper, I was so excited that it was,
yeah, yeah. Because I would have gone along with the same thought and
yeah,
stopped my yeah. I
I
would have been
know.
satisfied with that first thought and moved on.
I know. I assumed that was true, and then I did one more Google search, and but now it's kind of even more cool. Like, what a coincidence.
Hmm. Yeah.
So
Multiple sources in your research, people always have multiple sources.
that's right.
Don't have time to stay up to date on the freshest sustainable agriculture news, events, and funding opportunities? You can trust NCAT to keep you connected with our weekly harvest e-newsletter. Subscribe today at ncat.org and get your weekly harvest delivered each Wednesday.
Some commonly used materials for potassium are potassium chloride, which is also called muriate of potash, MOP.
Hmm.
Potassium sulfate, which is also called SOP, sulfate of potash, and there are organic approved forms of that particular fertilizer.
Is
All right, wood ashes. People still use them for a source of potassium, but you have to be careful because they do have a liming effect. So if you need both lime and potassium, wood ashes are great.
yeah, we've used that in some garden spots just here. We heat with a wood fireplace, and periodically I'll side dress a given raised bed or something a shrub of some sort out in the garden area.
Yeah, and I feel confident in our ability to do that just because our soils tend to lean acidic. So
Right.
I mean we're pretty casual with our gardening here. So I don't soil test our hodgepodge of raised beds, but I feel like a bucket full of ashes now and then is not going to hurt anything.
Yeah.
So green sand and granite dust are also sources of potassium, but they're pretty low concentrations of potassium and very slow availability. And just to go back to what countries these days are producing a lot of potassium, the top 10 countries of potassium production in 2022. Now, should I start from the bottom and go up or top down?
Oh, no. Let's have
Countdown?
some suspense. Go
Okay.
from the bottom to the top.
Number 10, Spain. Number
Okay.
9, Laos. Number 8, Chile. Number 7, Jordan.
Hmm.
Number 6, Israel. Number 5, Germany. I'm glad they're still on there since they were the first ones.
Yeah.
You know. Number 4, Belarus.
Fun.
Number 3, Russia.
Okay.
Number 2, China.
All
And
right.
number 1, Canada.
Interesting.
Yeah, so you can see how geopolitical events might disrupt things in the potassium supply.
So I'm just picturing a globe. Those aren't like regionally connected. That seems pretty well spread out. So these are all, I'm assuming, places that used to have inland seas or are part of an inland sea or
Yeah,
something like. Yeah.
yeah. So that's the sort of geological nature of potassium, is it is pretty spread out over the world, especially compared to phosphorus, which
Mm.
has much fewer, concentrations. And don't ask
And
me the geology behind that. I forget.
it's okay. Is it mined in a similar way, like surface mining?
Yeah, I think there is that kind of mining, and there's also solution mining because it is so soluble. They,
Oh, the water mining where they use a water cannon.
yeah. And the United States does have some potash production. They have underground mines in New Mexico and then solution mines in Michigan and Utah and surface brines in Utah.
Oh, from the Great Salt Lake.
Yeah,
Probably.
I'm assuming. And then potash deposits in Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, North Dakota, and Utah are under development for solution mining.
Interesting. Those
Yeah.
places all sound like they have lots of water available.
Good point.
You
Yeah,
know?
when we're talking about the sustainability of this fertilizer, you have to think about how much energy is used in the mining and refining and transporting, but also the water use in these solution mines,
Yeah.
Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah. I don't know about
Yeah.
North Dakota, but the other ones for sure.
Well, North Dakota's going to be it's a arid grassland, and most of its water comes from the Ogallala Aquifer, which
Hmm.
is being pumped dry in a dramatic fashion all through the Great Plains. So, it's not a super sustainable. North Dakota is not famous for its rivers. Let's put it that way.
Good point. Good point. And just to I gave you that list of the top 10, but 2/3 of all the potassium reserves are supplied by only 3 countries, Canada, Russia, and Belarus. So they really dominate.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That's insane.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I'm assuming the U.S. is a net importer of
Yes.
of potassium.
Yes.
Special K. I'm gonna start calling it Special K.
Special K. Now I'm gonna want cereal. Yes. Yes, because we use so much in our croplands. And the US does produce some, but just not enough.
So it gets depleted just as you harvest. It's like any of the other elements. It's being depleted from the soil because you harvest the crop that's got the potassium in it, and then we eat it basically.
Yes, it's that
Okay.
basically broken nutrient cycle of just
Right.
exporting it from the soil in the form of plant matter.
Right.
And it does get leached away too naturally with rain and runoff. In natural ecosystems, it cycles and recycles. Picture a forest with the leaves falling and then turning back into soil, and
Right.
it's protected from runoff. So some might leach out of the soil, but it's basically equilibrium.
Got it.
But in farming systems where you're removing, you have to replace it with
Yeah.
something.
Yeah, industrial farming sometimes reminds me of just like mining
Yeah, it really it can
with
be.
extra steps. It's like mining with extra steps.
Yeah. And then we mine in other places to continue mining in the farm fields.
Yeah, it's a good system. It works fine.
Yeah, totally logical.
No notes.
You're going to have notes about this. So just 2 companies supply 85% of the North American potash market, according
That
to the
doesn't seem like it's a
FTC.
problem.
No. And between 2020 and 2022, those Nutrien, one of the companies, saw profits increase 1,575% in 2 years.
What?
Profits.
That's not possible. How is that
It's
possible? How
uh
much did farmers have to pay for those profits?
right. I will link to the article about that, but I just wanted to point that out that maybe farmers are being mined as well. I mean, for real, it's
Yeah,
just not right.
especially like I'm a little angry right now. The farmers' profits haven't dramatically gone up that I've noticed. So it seems like that's a problem.
Yeah, I mean, if farmers were also making
1,000% profit.
1,575% more, then great.
Yeah. Oh my.
But yeah.
And 2 companies. Yeah, that doesn't seem like a
I mean, it's
monopoly at
just
all.
not sustainable. Like we talk about local production, localized,
That is
political.
very frustrating.
It is.
That's
I
frustrating.
just wanted to share that. Some people think that the rise in cost in potassium has to do with that domination of those companies, and not
Sure.
just the supply chain interruptions. Now, say you decide I'm sick of spending too much on potassium.
Mhm.
I want to know how I can use less, make my soils, closer to that equilibrium kind of natural system.
Oh, I thought you were going to say burn all your trees.
No, don't leave the trees alone. For goodness sake,
Stop.
they've had
Stop mansplaining to the trees.
yeah, the trees get to stay where they are, and I'm going to share some pointers for becoming more potassium independent. First of all, we've mentioned this one, soil testing. Make sure you need some before you apply it. That
Right.
seems pretty simple, but a lot of times people just go out and buy like an NPK that has, 10, 10, 10.
Right.
But maybe don't do that. Test
No.
first,
Yeah.
see if you need it.
Yeah.
And it will wash away. So it's not like you're stocking it up for future seasons. Like it will
Right.
it will it will run off.
So for us, what I've done in the past, and we haven't had to do too much of this. I think the only inputs we put into the pastures in the last, what is it, 15 years now, were lime to bring the pH up to where it needed to be, and then a couple years ago, it was the potassium for the couple fields. So yeah, I mean it's pretty durable. I mean, like in the scheme of things, it's not going to. And what we've done, sorry, I got sidetracked by my own sidetrack. So what we've done to apply it, that particular nutrient, we put it in the kind of early spring. That's been what I've done. Mainly is just so the plants are right as the plants are starting to get going. My theory was that they would uptake that before it had a good chance to run off.
Yes, you jumped to number 2, fertilizer timing. You got it.
Okay, sweet. I did a thing right.
You did a thing. It
Yeah.
is soluble, so apply when it is needed, especially if it's, one of the fast dissolving forms rather than like the green sand or something that's very slow release. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, time it so the plants take it up because it'll run off and get wasted if you don't.
Right. What about animal manure? Is it a source?
It is a source.
Got plenty of that.
I did. And okay, I don't want to jump ahead, so I'll get back to that. You also mentioned pH. If you maintain a good soil pH, you will have more potassium availability. And now I'm going to get a little soil geeky. There's something called the complementary ion effect. And this is,
no.
I know, I'm not sure I can even explain it that well, but different cations bond more strongly to the soil, and they can like bump off other ones so that there's no room for them.
Sounds like a high school dance somehow. Go ahead.
So aluminum is a acidic element. So if your soil is acidic, it will have higher levels of aluminum in it.
Okay.
Basically, if your
it.
soil is more acidic, there will be more aluminum, and it will take up the spots on the cation exchange sites where the calcium, magnesium, and potassium where you want that to be.
Okay.
So if you have a good pH, you'll have less aluminum and more of the basic cations,
Right.
calcium,
So
magnesium, and potassium.
Okay.
Good pH, important. Just remember that.
Aluminum bad.
Aluminum bad. It can cause toxicity. So
Cows don't like metal.
right. Don't feed them tin cans.
We do have that one goat though.
Well, she's a problem, but yes. Also, point number 4, improve your soil health overall. And by this, I mean manage it so you build better soil structure, increase your mycorrhizal fungi populations. So I'm going to refer people to a podcast I did with Dr. Bill Robertson about soil health, and he talked about cotton farmers and potassium, and it was super interesting. And basically, using cover crops, these cotton farmers improved their soil health and reduced their need to apply potassium.
Yeah, my general rule of thumb is no bare soil.
No bare soil. Keep it protected. Keep living roots growing as much of the year as possible. And then here's another one to improve soil health. If you're growing annual crops, if that's one of your enterprises, there are crop rotations that include putting it in perennial cover for a few years. It's called like ley rotations, Ley, and and you like put it in pasture, let animals graze it for 2 to 4 years, and then you switch it into annual production for 2 to 4 years.
That reminds me of how farmers farmed a long time ago.
Yeah. Not new.
Funny how that goes.
But they've been studying it more and more, and they're like, whoa, this really does work.
Turns out the way humans did this for thousands of years might actually still work.
Yeah. So so that's another good way to improve soil health. And then as you know, feeding hay on the fields in the winter, either bale grazing or rolling hay bales out, keeps the nutrients that are in the hay like on the fields where you want it to be.
Yeah, it's my favorite way of actually doing fertilizer for the farm. It's the numbers changed since the last time I used it, but back when I first was taught this at a grazing conference, half at that time, so numbers have changed, but at that time, half the cost of your bale of hay was given back to you in the form of free fertilizer that came with it. So what you're actually doing is you're asking the hay farmer to go ahead and export his resources over to your farm and then let the cows spread it around.
Yes.
A fun little trick with that is just because of the way the gut on a cow works, you can feed hay in one area. The residue may stay there and be fertilizer, and that's fine. But if you then move the cows within a day or two, that hay you fed them will be pooped out in a different area. So you can do
Mm.
tricky little things like that. If you're rotating your cattle during the winter, it's a thing to consider. So depending on, circumstances, I may feed hay in a given spot and then quickly move the cows to another spot to either divide up that nutrient load or concentrate the cows on a particular area for quite a long time, being careful not to get the soil just too churned up in the winter. But because that pasture in particular needs a lot more nutrients than some other place will.
Mhm. Yeah, really targeting where it's being deposited is a very good way to do it.
Yeah.
And
And I've
let the
had,
animals spread it instead of having to drive a tractor around and spreading it.
yeah, the less time I'm on a tractor, the better, general.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
But
along those lines, here's an interesting strategy. So maybe instead of making hay, you graze cattle. Now, these are just general numbers, but that I found. But Bermuda grass hay removes from the field 400 pounds per acre of potassium,
good enough.
where, whereas in a Bermuda grass pasture, it's 1 pound per acre that
That's
gets
a big difference.
Yeah. If you're worried about potassium, just graze
Mhm.
cows instead of making hay. So, but in all seriousness, you can choose crops that use less potassium. Basically, the more of the plant that you remove, the more potassium you're going to remove. So, like
Sure.
a grain crop like oats removes 20 pounds per acre.
Mm.
Um, and corn silage removes 160 pounds per acre versus corn grain, which is 50 pounds per acre.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, of course it is. Yeah. I wonder how native grasses would fare
I
as
don't
far
know.
as like the removal, because you can with round bales back in the olden days of square bales. The majority of the reason people went to things like Bermuda grass was because it was easy to put through the baling machine, and so that's why we moved away from things like Johnson grass, etc., as a baled forage. But the brown bales don't; those machines aren't that sensitive. So I wonder if that would be as significant of a difference.
I don't know. I'm sure there's literature out there on the different grasses and the
Right.
nutrient levels. These numbers I got from an Alabama study. So I'll link to all the things that I refer to in the show notes so you guys can read my research.
Yeah,
Um,
my big goal is to one day not to have to feed hay. It's been impossible for the last many decades. But like turns out animals, if it's not overstocked, will live through the winter on forage that goes dormant in the fall.
right.
It's a thing that buffalo do, or
They
deer, and things like that.
Yes.
Um, so I mean, you have to create that stockpile, and that's been our challenge personally here on this farm. Is we don't have a farm sized for no hay, livestock
Mhm.
wise.
Mhm.
And part of that's economics because it's cheaper to buy hay and have the extra cows. You make more money that way. But environmentally, it would be better if we sized the herd to the amount of grass that we feed them year round.
Yeah. Yeah, I always feel bad for the hay farmers because you can really tell when you do a bunch of soil testing on a farm, you can tell which field was hayed because
Yes.
it's so low in potassium.
Mm.
That is a classic sign. All right, moving right along. Crop rotation and cover cropping. So I mentioned the lay rotation, but I thought
Mhm.
this was really interesting. I found this on the MOFGA piece about potassium. While microbes dependably hold nitrogen and phosphorus in their bodies in the soil, they have little use for potassium. So if you plow down a cover crop that is high in potassium, plant a cash crop or another cover crop to grab it because the
Mm.
microbes won't.
Right,
How
and it's going to
interesting is
wash
that?
away.
And it'll wash away.
Yeah,
So
that
your
is
cover
interesting.
crops are really protecting the potassium
Hmm.
as well as the soil in general. But I thought, oh, the microbes have little use for potassium. That's sad for potassium.
I
It's left
always
out.
thought they were a little snobby.
Yeah. And oh, I already mentioned this pointer of like maybe switching from annual crops to perennial pasture and graze instead of removing all this plant matter. I
Hmm.
mean, that's a big economic shift. That's easy to say, but like if potassium becomes so like such a limiting factor, if it's so expensive, it might force people to rethink what they're growing, why they're growing it.
Yes,
Uh,
and especially if it's a limited supply with the technology that we have currently, it's not a renewable resource if you're mining it. I mean, that is
correct.
got a time. It's got a clock that's ticking on it. Well, and also just for anybody else, keep in mind that 1,000% profit increase. You
Yeah,
don't have to do that. You don't have to give them that money.
right, right. You can keep it and spend it
Yeah.
on cover crop seeds or something else.
Mhm.
So those are the main pointers I had for becoming more potassium independent. I'm sure there's other strategies.
Burning all the trees.
No, stop it. Keep the trees where they are.
I say that as I'm sitting in the middle of a forest. So
Yeah.
yeah, just want to make that clear. We're not big tree burners.
No.
It's a bit.
Yes. Yeah, that's the story of potassium. I
That is very fascinating.
I thought it was quite interesting, and I think it's good to learn the history so that you know where we came from, and so you can see how we got to where we are. We're currently mining at mineral potassium for most of our farms, and maybe we just need to sort of look to the natural models of cycling nutrients and then return the law of returning, those nutrients. And basically, any plant matter or manure is going to have some potassium in it.
Right.
Um, so finding the
Yeah, the
organic
more you
sources.
can, it's been a topic for decades, but in certain circles in the ag world, the more you can mimic a natural system, the more productive your farm's going to be
Yes.
overall. So yeah, it's back to that same conversation, just more evidence and detail now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I listened to a great podcast episode about biomimicry, and they ask the question, how does nature solve this problem? Like first, how
Hmm.
nature's probably already solved it. So,
Right, right.
so that's the question to ask yourself when you're looking at farm systems, um, including fertility management. Thank
Lots
you.
of things to go look up now.
I know, I know. I'm gonna go make some meat tea for
That's right. There's my serving of meat tea with a slice of lemon in
Yeah. Oh, gross. Sour,
it.
sour meat tea. Maybe not. Maybe not. All right. Well, thank you, Jeremy, for joining me. And I will link to the nitrogen and phosphorus episodes and the Bill
They're very
Robertson
good.
episode. Thank you. And all the resources I used to find all this information I shared with everyone today. And yeah, start rethinking potassium. That's my parting words. Jeremy, do you have any parting words?
Don't burn all the trees down.
Thank you. Thank you. That's great. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me on. It was fun.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Additional information about this episode and related resources can be found at attra.ncat.org. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe to Voices from the Field wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Rich Myers. ATTRA, Voices from the Field, is produced by the National Center for Appropriate Technology, headquartered in Butte, Montana. It's supported by the USDA Rural Business Cooperative Service as part of NCAT's ATTRA Sustainable Agriculture program. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this recording are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of the USDA or NCAT. We'll catch you again next week, and until then, keep on farming.